Hello, Googleization Nation, and welcome to The Whole You, Work, Home, Life, a GGG Unleashed podcast with thought leader Joe Serio. In each of Joe's episodes, he's going to be raw and real with you on what it takes to be the whole you at work, home, and life in order to thrive today and in the future. Let's begin.
Welcome to The Whole You. I'm Joe Serio. The first couple of episodes, we talked about your three superpowers: clarity, focus, and consistency. After that, we visited with Dennis Welch, who is a songwriter and spent 13 years at Gallup organization. And we talked about creativity. So we wanted to take it a step further and talk about health and wellness, resilience-related issues. Today, we're meeting with Tanya Tarr. She is a senior writer at Forbes magazine. Look, if I spend some time introducing her fully, it's going to take the entire time. So let's just cut to the chase. She's senior writer at Forbes magazine. She spent 20 years working on political campaigns, behind the scenes with election data, analyzing, studying people's behavior and choices. She's a behavioral scientist. She's worked with military families on military family readiness and conducted studies along those areas. I could go on, but I'm not going to. So here we are, Tanya Tarr. Tanya, hi.
Hi, Joe. How are you?
I'm good.
Yeah, you can add executive health coach to that now.
Executive health coach as well.
Yeah,
nice.
Yeah, I'm sitting for the national exam in July, so
excellent.
Have not taken an exam in 25 years. It'll be very interesting.
Well, maybe we'll talk about stress management.
Yeah, maybe it's all related. Look at that.
That's right.
Yeah.
So look, there's a word that has probably been beaten into the ground, and that's resilience. Mm-hmm. We hear it all the time, the resilient leader and the resilient person. I want to talk about your perspective on resilience and wellness. Mm-hmm. And I know that you have a couple of models that you use that I love, by the way. And
thanks.
I'll just tell the audience that recently we had Tanya come out to present at one of my leadership retreats at a ranch outside San Antonio for government employees, and she was fantastic. So we want to give you just a little piece of that today.
Yeah. Resilience is a very interesting word, especially depending on what generation you're talking to. I think a lot of the times people think of resilience, at least for the millennial Gen Z, they have sort of this resistance to the concept of resilience. I think because they think of it as pushing beyond a point where it's healthy, or that it's rigid, which is funny because if you look up the word resilience, it actually means squishy, right? Your ability to bounce back. Yeah. And I think it's important to think of it that way, both because it's silly, but also it's adaptive, right? So it's having situational awareness and then figuring out a way to stay bouncy, right? To adapt around it. A lot of what I do is help people understand some of the psychological frameworks that help us stay bouncy, right? And help us actually think of the solution end of resilience, and specifically how to burnout proof yourself, burnout proof your life, burnout proof your workplace. Because I think we tend to spend a lot of times focusing on, oh, I'm exhausted, I'm burnt out. And the funny thing is, resilient leaders, there's sort of the old school resilience, right? Which is being stoic and not paying attention to the multiple spheres of our lives, and then dropping dead at 50 or 60, right, from chronic illness, heart disease, cancer, diabetes. But I think the newer version of resilient leadership, and that's not an age thing, by the way, because I also know leaders that are boomers that have characteristics of being an adaptive leader, of understanding that sustainability is actually a big part of resilience, right? And understanding, what's the deployment, right? Not just the mustering up into action, but how do we make intelligent demobilization and emotional demobilization in ways that actually close the stress loop and help us keep going, help us continue to be aligned with a sense of purpose. Yeah.
There are so many things going on in my head right now. So one way I think about it is you want to have structure, and within that structure, maximum flexibility. in terms of the squishiness, right?
Right, yeah.
How can I maneuver and navigate the situation that I'm in without being so strict and so structured that I don't even have the capacity to respond to changes in my environment? And my environment being externally or internally.
Right, yeah.
What am I going through?
Right.
And we've gotten to a point where for a long time, maybe the generation of the Great Depression survivors and the world wars and all that, where we were not allowed to or expected to question feelings or be allowed to cry, maybe especially as men,
Yeah.
and to be more quote unquote emotional. But the fact of the matter is, none of this is new.
Yeah, that's true.
It's not like we haven't known this for 3,000 years.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Joe, because I think we both follow all sorts of wellness and well-being folks and leadership folks. By the way, just as a side note, I consider myself a health and well-being executive coach, not a wellness coach. I know that this is a distinction that's lost on a lot of people, and I probably shouldn't get on that hill. But wellness, I feel like, is very tactical. Like, here are some self-care options versus well-being, which I think is different because I think of well-being from a systems approach. I also think of well-being as a critical strategic management issue, because all those folks that did do well, especially of the older generation, they understood that we live in an ecosystem, overlapping ecosystems, and there's home life, there's community life, there's professional life. And it's funny because, you know, if you listen to or read some of the big influencers out there, they tell you all these different things. You got to take an ice bath. You got to eat only protein. You got to, you know, do all this stuff. You got to make sure you have a certain type of sleep or not enough sleep or whatever. They give you this whole laundry list. And there are not a ton, but there's a significant number of peer-reviewed longitudinal studies that show that quality social relationships are one of the biggest drivers of longevity and health. And I also feel like, and this is again more anecdotal, but if I look at the leaders that I admire across generations, the ones that are resilient, the ones that I particularly am interested in, leaders that don't raise their voice, right, in situations where the norm is to raise the voice, right? But a lot of these folks had really strong support structures, and they were people of faith. And that's not so much like we should all be people of faith, but they had a community that they were tapped into. You know, a lot of them had hobbies, right? And even like Winston Churchill, he would paint, right? So like there is this sort of set of habits and behaviors that help boost that, keep that ecosystem healthy. So,
you know, it's interesting you mentioned that. So a couple of things go through my mind personally.
Yeah.
So I'm the 9th of 12 kids. My mom lived to be 88, and she was highly connected to people, highly involved in the community, very active. Up until she was probably around 85, she worked because she loved it. She loved what she did.
Yeah, I bet it helped keep her mentally healthy too.
For sure.
Yeah.
And a lot of her work was people involved.
Yeah.
Right? And then I think about my father, who was exactly the opposite and was very isolated and did not really go out into the community, he barely had any circle of good friends or people to talk to.
Yeah.
And he died at 68.
Wow.
And I think that neither one of those is coincidental.
Yeah.
And I've read the reports about the longitudinal studies of what is the key factor to longevity.
Yeah.
And it's things like connection and engagement and all of those things you mentioned.
Friendship, yeah.
Yeah. And isn't it funny that it comes down to people and relationship, which automatically translates or includes communication?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so you mentioned, you know, I'm attracted to the non-yellers, right? How can I have influence on people and help their well-being?
Yeah.
Even if they personally are in a difficult, maybe even untenable situation at home, whether it's economics or relationship or spouse support or anything like that.
Yeah.
And it comes down to that connection, which we've lost a lot of, partly because I think of the philosophical aspects of the American dream. Chasing.
Yeah.
When I get my own home and the white picket fence and I make enough money, then, right? All these if-then statements that we've grown up with.
Yeah.
If I get the degree, then I will. If I get married to the right person, then I will be happy.
All conditional.
They're all conditional.
Yeah.
And so often the rest of what we do is conditional.
Yeah. Yeah, it kind of puts you in a pending space. So there's like two things I want to add to this. The things that like your mom and understanding there's like this ecosystem that keeps, like she probably had a sense of purpose. She had friends, she had work. And I think people feel burnt out when they don't feel a sense of agency, when they don't feel competent, when they don't feel a sense of belonging. Those three things are important. They're part of self-determination theory, which I think of self-determination theory as the antidote to burnout, right? It's the opposite. A couple things that came to mind were Norman Schwarzkopf was one of the first leaders to support family readiness, and he understood the importance of that. He understood that soldiers feel a sense of emotional stability when their people are taken care of, when they are in harm's way. I thought that was pretty significant because it did cause a lot of changes, positive changes. The other thing is in terms of longitudinal studies, if you're a nerd like us and you want to look up a study that is fascinating, has been fascinating for epidemiologists and scientists for decades, it's something called the Rossetto effect. Have I told you about the Rossetto?
I think you mentioned it.
Yeah, these are the type of things I get really nerdy about because it shows very clearly, connection is important from an emotional standpoint, but it also actually helps our heart health. So the Rossetto community was in eastern Pennsylvania, and it was a very, very tight-knit Italian-American community. Most of the people in this community were from a specific region in Italy, had immigrated. They worked very difficult jobs. I don't know if it was like steel milling or mining, but it was very physical, difficult, blue-collar jobs. And it was at a time, this is like the 40s, 50s, and 60s, where women typically stayed at home. These are lower middle income folks. The community, though, was very, very tight-knit, right? So, like, everyone's looking out for everybody else's kids. But so the doctor that helped this community realized for about 10 years, none of the men in this community had any heart disease whatsoever, which was, like, completely shocking, both for the time, but also for the fact that they were working very difficult manual jobs. They were very Italian. Okay, so they were not eating keto, right? Like, you know what I mean? There's cheese, there's lard, there's lots of pasta. They're drinking wine, they're smoking cigars. But for like 10 years, there was no heart disease. And the doctor didn't know why that was or what to make of it. And like I'm telling you, this community has been studied by multiple, dozens and dozens of researchers because they were like, what's going on here? Why are they living this extraordinary health? They went and studied people in that part of Italy that everybody came from, and they didn't have that same effect of no heart disease. But like every immigrant community, they want their kids to do better, right? So this tight-knit community became a little less tight-knit because the kids then got better educational opportunities and they moved away, and then that community wasn't tight-knit in the same way. So what happened? Heart disease goes up, and it looks like every other community and every other cohort of that male-type patient. And what this doctor and dozens of other researchers have just decided to accept is that part of it was because it was so tight-knit. That was keeping everybody heart healthy. And what's interesting is I just saw a TED Talk. I'll be sure to send to put in the liner notes, like the studies and the citations, because I think that's really important. But they found recently that when we experience oxytocin, which is the trust neurotransmitter, it's what we feel when we feel connection, when we give hugs, things like that. But it doesn't just make us regulate mood better. It actually makes our physiological heart muscle better. Oxytocin actually feeds the heart muscle. So if you think about it, if you're in a tight-knit community, even it doesn't matter if socioeconomic status or anything like that, or even literally the food that you're eating, you still can manage to be heart healthy, right? So that's why I always laugh when I see these laundry lists of, ice baths, raw food, whatever. Social connection should actually be at the top of that list, right? And that builds the foundation that you can build all sorts of other cool things on. But social connection is actually the first thing you should start looking at if you're trying to understand where am I in my well-being,
Perfect. So as we go forward, let's talk about the frameworks that you've presented in the past, which you call how and wow.
Yeah.
And I want
super cheesy.
Hey, you know what? I remember it.
That's true. Yes, it's sticky.
We remember remember the cheese.
Yeah.
Because in our experiences, yours in your world and me in my world, one thing that we see a lot is that people, like you said, like social should be at the top, except we're running around saying, I need a gym membership and I'm gonna drive myself crazy trying to stay on this diet and all these other
green
factors.
smoothies.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And all these other factors that we get caught up in and we kind of missing the point.
Yeah.
So lay out your how and wow and some of the things that people can almost reflect on, the questions that they can ask themselves about, well, how do I even do this? How do I think about my well-being?
Join Joe and Tanya next month for part 2 of this 3-part conversation when Tanya shares her approach and framework, the how and wow for taking care of our well-being. That's it for today's episode. Thank you for tuning in and digging deep into what's ahead for the future as the whole you. We'll be back next month with Joe for another episode. But until then, visit his website for additional information at joeserio.com. And remember, don't let the shift hit your plans.